the cost of what they were paying for just flat out electricity, and that when you've paid off the cost of insulation, you basically wind up all saving all that money you were spending on electricity.
I'm thinking about solar. First, I got to take a good look at my roof. But let's talk about what is it that you're hoping that the work group brings to the table, recommendations ultimately.
So they're going to come back with recommendations. There are a couple of things out there. There were 3 major studies done for, I think, Seattle, Boston, and New York that looked at the path forward. And a lot of that stuff is totally replicable from Montgomery County. Buildings are buildings, transportation is transportation, housing is housing. So a lot of their recommendations we're going to be looking at. I didn't see the point of spending a lot of money to get another study that would tell me the same thing. But we're looking from the resident groups is, so what is Montgomery County specific? Where are our specific local opportunities to do things? We wanted to engage our residents. We have amazingly talented people here. There are people from all kinds of, federal agencies that work in this area, from private sector and, nonprofit groups who do environmental work, who wanted the opportunity and volunteered to be part of these groups in Montgomery County. We have more talent than we ever would have had if we had simply written a check to somebody to write a report. So I'm really looking forward to the recommendations. Well, those recommendations will go into an actual plan. We'll be looking at what we can do in the short term, and immediately we'll have more longer range goals. And the other thing is that we're going to be informed by, not everything is feasible today, but there are some pretty rapid technological advances coming forward. There's glass for windows that generates electricity, which is not a common product right now. And there's battery storage, which is going to get significantly cheaper than it is today. Things like that will make changes possible in a couple of years that we couldn't feasibly talk about today. So that's where we're going.
We have less than a minute, Mr. Elrich. 2020 is a big year, presidential elections, 2020 census, once again, legislative session in Annapolis. Those are things that we're going to be talking about at the beginning of the year. But just to wrap up the show, first year as county executive, what did you like best and what did you like least? Very quickly.
What did I like best? I felt really good about the early childhood initiative and the climate change stuff. I thought that was really significant, and the racial equity. It wasn't one thing. Those 3 things were really important to me. What I like least, the financial uncertainty was really not fun. I mean, getting elected, wanting to do progressive things and move the ball forward and spend your first 3 months figuring out how much you have to cut to get to fit into a budget is like doing really kind of soulless, unhappy work, but necessary work. But, I was looking at, and want to figure out how do you build things going forward, which means we need more tools in our toolkit, not how do I limit my tools so I can get this budget to balance.
Thank you for sitting with us today. And for you watching at home, to remember, for more information, to visit montgomerycountynd.gov. I'm Laura Vergelli. Thank you for watching.
In Montgomery County, we have a goal to reduce waste and recycle 70% of all waste by 2020. By recycling and reducing waste, we save natural resources and make our community even better. So recycle at home, work, school, everywhere, and keep recycling going. For more information, call the Montgomery County, Maryland Division of Solid Waste Services at 311 or visit montgomerycountymd.gov/recycling.
Keep it going.
Recycle more now.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started with our joint Education and Culture and Health and Human Services Committee meeting. We are delving into our CIP, or Capital Improvement Program budget, and specifically surrounding our issues with our Department of Health and Human Services and, of course, Montgomery County Public Schools. We have a number of different topics which we're going to talk about today. One of which is child care renovations, and of course, obviously, with the great work of both the county executive and then Council President Navarro in terms of spearheading work that we would do in early child care and education, but then also with our high school wellness centers and our school-based health and linkages to learning centers that we have huge need for in our community, and certainly ones in which tie to the Curran Commission recommendations as well about building truly collaborative community schools, ones that incorporate all of the aspects of health as well as mental well-being, support for the community as a whole, parent involvement, all of those kinds of things are all incorporated in this model for both our high school wellness centers as well as our linkages to learning centers, our school-based health centers. So certainly it meets a lot of those needs that we see. So let's get right into it. I want to welcome, and so folks come up from our Department of Health and Human Services. I know that Dr. Kroll has let us know that he's running late from another event and will be over here shortly. Department of General Services, as well as Montgomery County Public Schools, and our Office of Management and Budget as well. And we're joined by Mary back there. So Vivian, I'll just turn it over to you to kind of walk us through the packet. I know we're going to start off first with our child care renovations and then go from there to wellness centers, and then I think linkages to learning after that.
Right. I'm actually wondering whether we should flip some of the projects. DGS is not yet here, and I think they may have information.
Okay.
If
No, that's fine.
questions.
That's fine.
So maybe
Yep.
we can start with the school-based programs.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right.
So the first one of that is the High School Wellness Center program. The PDF is at circles 3 to 4 of your packet. For fiscal year 21 to 26, the executive is recommending $1.2 million over the 6-year period to support construction of a wellness center at John F. Kennedy High School. This is a continuing project. The source of funding is GEO bonds, and there is no the estimated fiscal year 21, the requested fiscal year 21 appropriation is $1.2 million. There is no estimated fiscal year 22 appropriation. The project description form, or PDF, indicates that construction on the Kennedy High School Wellness Center is scheduled to be completed in fiscal year 22. There's an update, too, regarding the Seneca Valley High School Wellness Center. It's scheduled to be completed and open when the school opens in September 2020. Council staff's recommendation is to approve the funding recommended by the executive for the Kennedy High School Wellness Center, but revised expenditure schedules to reflect the projected amounts to be spent in fiscal year 21 for the Seneca Valley High School Wellness Center and fiscal year 22 for the Kennedy High School Wellness Center.
And I think that that's great. I see we're joined by Director Kroll, so thank you very much, sir. Let me just start off by saying that, and I know this is not my district, but I grew up here, and Kennedy was my home high school, and the need is great. I've worked with Councilmember Navarro on a number of different initiatives there, including ones that deal specifically with making sure that we're reaching out to our community and giving them the resources that they need. And I want to thank Health and Human Services for their great work. When we really provide those kinds of wraparound services, it makes a tremendous difference as you're sitting around at a table with parents and children who definitely need the assistance and are given it right away immediately. It changes, certainly their perspective, not only in terms of their belief in government and that government works for them, but also their perspective in terms of what their futures can entail. We see better performance from our kids when we have these programs that are in place, and it certainly is one that continues to build a trust between local government and the community as a whole. And so let me turn to Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Definitely want to echo your sentiments. This is a long time coming, an area that once upon a time really didn't have a lot of amenities, including, I remember when we finally cut the ribbon for the Mid-County Rec Center. It was like a big deal, and back with the Kennedy Cluster Project and all of that. But one really wonderful thing as we entered Wheaton High School for the Vision Zero Forum, it was so cool to see the electronic board talking about listing all the services that are being offered through the Wellness Center there. So really, truly important for us to align the mental health services that we can and provide it in this fashion. And the only thing I will just want to put a pin on is obviously when we get to conversations of the operating budget, let's make sure that we have the funding in there so that we don't end up with the situation we ended up in Wheaton. Councilman Marlborough else remembers when he was on the other side of not having the operating dollars to start right away. So, but really wonderful that we're able to expand both into the Seneca Valley High School as well as the Kennedy High School.
Any other comments from my colleagues? All right, so we'll adopt your recommendations from staff. Next
Okay,
item.
moving on, school-based health and linkages to learning centers. For the fiscal year 21 to 26 period, the county executive is recommending $1.184 million over the 6-year period to construct linkages to learning projects or space at Silver Spring International Middle School, Gaithersburg Elementary School number 8, and the project also includes design funding for the linkages space at Roscoe, Nix, and Cresthaven Elementary Schools. All projects are continuing. The linkages program at Silver Spring International Middle School is one that exists. The other schools don't actually have current linkages programs going. The recommended funding source is $1.158 million in GO bonds and $26,000 in current revenue. There is a requested fiscal year 21 appropriation of $629,000 and a estimated fiscal year 22 appropriation of $529,000. Council staff provides the schedule updates for the completion dates for the MCPS projects for the schools on that are included in this project on page 5 of your packet that shows Maryvale is being completed. It's not actually showing in the PDF language as a project because, you know, I think the executive anticipated that it would be completed during this current fiscal year. But because of that, council staff is recommending that, again, the expenditure schedules for each of these projects reflect what is anticipated to happen in terms of showing expenditures and construction in the fiscal years where the projects are expected to be completed. In addition, Lee Middle School, while there's funding in the project for Lee Middle School, it was originally intended to be completed in fiscal year 20. However, that school project has been changed and delayed, and as a result, it doesn't look like, again, the expenditure schedule is caught up in terms of when we anticipate that project to be implemented.
So let me pause there for a minute because it brings about a larger question, and I know that we had the recommendations of the strategic plan before that kind of outlined what we were trying to accomplish, and we haven't been able to keep pace with those recommendations in terms of our goals, right, and what we wanted to achieve. And so I guess part of it is, are we going to have a new strategic plan that's outlined for what our next schools will be, and is it going to be aligned with what we see is happening within MCPS in terms of their construction cycle? Because when I look at the need for Montgomery Village and Watkins Middle, or Montgomery Village Middle and Neelsville Middle. Neelsville is now slated as a part of the school system to have its redo, so obviously it should be a part of that redo. So are we making these kinds of adjustments and changes and keeping pace with what we see is happening with the school CIP? Whoever would like to answer.
Hi. Good afternoon, Lindsay Lucas with OMB. So yes, every year in the fall, we do meet with MCPS to get an update about their anticipated construction schedule to make sure we're all aligned. So we can review what schools are open, look at different criteria that's been established as to what schools should receive a linkage learning or a wellness center. So we do try to stay aligned with what's coming on. Of course, that's also early in the season prior to the recommended CIP comes out, and so sometimes there are changes that we cannot adapt to as quickly, but we are always trying to be aware and try to work closely with MCPS to make sure we are staying on top of it. But I can also turn it to Raymond Carl to explain a little bit more about that if he wants.
Raymond Kroll, Department of Health and Human Services. I think you've done just fine.
All right. Well, I think that for us, our hope is, and you know, Councilmember Navarro and I, who are the veterans in this joint committee, have been having this discussion with HHS and OMB for a very long time. So I know that this new administration, Dr. Kroll, welcome to this new discussion around CIP and linkages to learning. It is an old one. You know, there are different discussions that we have amongst programs to where we're not sure about the efficacy. We're not sure. We're still trying to delineate what the data may be that will give us a real accurate picture of how effective this is. There is no one in our community who questions the great work that comes out of our linkages to learning facilities throughout the county. And so from that perspective, this is a win-win all around, and we need to do them everywhere. We've continuously asked about trying to be aggressive when it comes to the promotion of these, especially in the areas that we know need them the most. When you look at like a South Lake Elementary School and what has happened there by having linkages to learning, and you look at grade performance that has totally accelerated beyond where they were before. And it's directly tied to the great recreation programs that we have, the Dream Academy, and linkages to learning. We know what we can do to make a difference. And this is when you're talking about one of the highest farms rates, one of the highest ESL rates in the county. All of those things combined, and we still are seeing a great escalation in terms of performance. And so from that perspective, that's the reason why I think something like this needs to be enhanced. And so my hope is, as Councilmember Navarro was saying, with our operating budget, we hope to at least see the support that's there for these existing programs as well as the proposed ones, but also a more aggressive approach in terms of what we can do in terms of expansion. So I'm not sure if anyone wanted to talk about that particular.
So I will say that first of all, I think thank you for the compliments to linkages to learning and to the team. They have been. My observation from the seat as chief was that they were doing an incredible job, and from the seat I'm in now, I get a chance to look deeper at the work that they do, and it is nothing short of amazing. So I support this notion that it would be ideal and it would be wonderful if we could have them everywhere. I know that's not feasible, but I do think that as we look and work with the school system to try to align with where they're going and see where that aligns with the need and the opportunity, we absolutely will continue to support and find ways to grow linkages.
The county executive is a great proponent of this services. Like, he has always spoken very highly of this, whether he was on council now as the county executive. And so I know this is a priority for him, and he wants to sit down and work with HHS and MCPS to better understand how can we be more aggressive. So I think this is something that's on his radar as well, and hopefully next year so we can look at different strategies and how we can do that.
So it's my hope that, again, aligned with that support, that we would see programmatic funding for Neelsville, especially since we know that we're looking at redoing that school. So I hope that that would be a part of what he's looking at in terms of supporting with Neelsville Middle School. Do you know if that's the case or not?
So when we met with MCPS in August, they did identify Neelsville as a potential location, and they said that within their fund they're able to provide a room for youth development activities or for training there. So we didn't put it into the CIP because from our understanding it was going to already be taken under MCPS's. But it's something we need to follow up on, but it was just not in the HHS CIP.
All right, as long as we're on board with that and folks are talking, so via the by-agency groups, if we're there. Vivian, do you have something to add to that?
So I guess it would be useful to know if this is moving forward. Again, is as far as Neelsville, if there's a room available, typically the linkages program has certain requirements in order to deliver the services, and it's more than just a room. So I guess it would be helpful to know what the planning is around that, and whether, in order to provide capital funding that would be needed, what is the timeline that council would need to act in order to do that?
So Seth Adams, Director, Department of Facilities Management for MCPS, and certainly a great question. I would say, again, from this perspective of collaboration, we look at every single project now from a perspective of, let's just include it. Let's include the space. Let's include it from a perspective of, maximizing from a program aspect, areas that we can take advantage of. We do know that certainly it seems like there's schools that absolutely this makes sense, and we are committed to incorporating that at the very onset of our design. So what we've done in the past is quite honestly start the design, start through collaboration, and then in subsequent CIPs, hopefully try to do a little bit of a catch up from an HHS perspective, but not for us to wait for the discussions or the decisions around funding, but to incorporate it and then come back and request additional funding through HHS.
So I'm not going to hog this conversation because I know that Councilmember Navarro had her light on, and now I see Councilmember Joando's light is on. But let me just say this. I don't know when the next recession is going to be, and I don't want us to be in a situation where we've been in before, to where we've gone in knowing that we had a great potential and opportunity that was there to do something and deliver on services that are needed to a community, and then not have the funds available to be able to program and to earmark for a project. We've been there and had these very tough decisions sitting here and making those kinds of horrible decisions for our community. If we have the opportunity to do it now, I would much rather we be in a situation to where we program the funds that we know are needed for a school that we know at one point had the highest farms rate out of any middle school in the county, Neelsville Middle School. And so if we know this, if we know that we're re-engineering the land, I know that school backwards and forwards. I spent a lot of time out there during polling time, and we've had a number of meetings there with the superintendent. We've had education budget forums there. There is no question that space is there to be able to do whatever it is we need to do at that school on that footprint. I know every bit of all of the land that we own there that's a part of that school. And so from that perspective, it would be unwise of us not to program this in to the current CIP. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you. So in previous sessions with the former director of HHS, the conversation that we had regarding linkages to learning and the strategic plan, et cetera, and I wish it was memorialized in the packets, had to do with taking advantage, working in collaboration with the school system, and I'm glad to hear what you just said, was to make sure that we would capitalize whenever there was a school that was slated for addition or for construction, that we would capitalize on that opportunity. And even if it wasn't a spec space, but a flex space, because we have either needs for linkages to learning or for after-school programs. And so the debate that we got into was, why aren't we taking advantage so that should be like a priority, that we would take advantage of that construction and just add that space, because we know we have plenty of need. And if it's to be a linkages to learning program, then it could be somehow adapted. Or what if it's a pre-K program? What if it's an after-school program? So that was one thing that I know the council was very, excited and forceful in making sure that we incorporate that into the process. And I don't know if maybe we need to do something more formal, but that was the whole point, was because we're talking about scale, of economies as we're doing the construction. And then now more recently, I think that through the conversations about, the mental health needs that students keep talking about and things like that, an opportunity to revisit the linkages to learning model and how it's, collaborating with other programs that we may have, maybe wellness centers, the street outreach program or whatever, because I am not a fan of static program design, especially when we know that the needs continue to change. And I think it behooves us to take a look at the, program design, the delivery design, and see whether we can incorporate, realign, leverage capacities that we might have, and shift the way that perhaps we are providing those services. And so I'm looking at those two options. So one is the physical space, which I think we absolutely should just take advantage of every time we have it. But then also, hopefully, by the time we get to the operating budget conversation, that we can see some options of how we could deliver. Because we had conversations about the Linkages Light program and all of that. But again, I feel like, why are we stuck on one model? Let's see how innovative we can really be with all the resources that we have invested already, and pull through all of those. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there as an opportunity that I'm looking forward to see, because to your point, as resources are more and more scarce and the need is greater, why not then look at the capacity and see how we can deploy that in a much more effective fashion.
Ms. Beck?
Ms. Navarro, I just wanted to clarify or ask something. In the past, I've heard you say very specifically you want us focusing, as we have, on the more needy schools. That's still your focus. Is that correct?
So the conversation that we had was twofold. So one of them was, okay, there's a strategic plan, let's say, for linkages to learning. Definitely, let's work with the school system to identify the schools that have the highest need and see how we can expand that. Conversely, if we have a CIP, the school system has a CIP where it has a schedule of construction of whatever it is, additional whatever, let's take advantage of all those opportunities. Obviously, looking at need, sure, but let's take advantage of that, because we are always in need of space. So, we might want flex space because we want to do Excel Beyond the Bell, but maybe it's a school that does need a Linkages to Learning. So they're kind of parallel conversations, but the idea was, let's not miss out whenever we're going through construction and incorporate some type of flex space. Obviously, in terms of, the strategic plan for Linkages to Learning, we need to look at that as well, but let's not lose the opportunity if there's construction going, because we know that to come back afterwards and add the space is going to be more expensive. So I think it's parallel tracks, if you will.
Councilmember Jawando?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of my colleagues who have been working on this for a long time. I've been working on the issue a long time, not on the council, but this issue of what do we do and how do we support our most at-risk students, right, is not a new issue for us or for those that have worked in this space. And I don't have the strategic plan in front of me. I'm glad to hear you're going to update it. But I think we need to make a decision and be bold, and when we present the new one, of saying, okay, if you read the goal of these programs, the programs provide accessible health, mental health, social and educational support services to at-risk children and their families. They all deserve that. It shouldn't be like, I refuse to accept the premise that we can't provide that for all of our at-risk families. And if we might not have the money today, we might not have the space today, but we sure need to have a plan to get there. And we need to be able to go out to the folks we represent and say, this is an imperative morally, it's an imperative economically, it's the right thing to do, and here's what we're going to have to do, i.e. reprioritize, increase revenue in XYZ way, and we have to make that plan, but we can't do it if we're not being bold and saying this is a need and stating as a fact that this is a right and should be accessible to all the kids that need it. So if you go through the list in the packet of, all the schools are, say, for 40% and higher of farms, and we can decide how we want to structure it and how we want to do it over time, realizing you can't snap your fingers. But I think we need to have a plan to address that for all of our at-risk students, and I know we're making incremental progress, but I can only imagine how frustrated my colleagues are to sit and not make it as fast as we need to. So it's our job collectively as the folks that are elected to represent and get to serve the public to go out and say, here's what we think is right and here's what we need to do to get there. And I'm willing to, and I know my colleagues are willing to do that, but we need to have that plan laid out in a systemic way and be bold in saying that this is not, that we can't get there for all students. No, yes, we can and we must. And here's why, and here's what it's going to cost, and here's what we're going to do over time. And I just want to challenge us as we update the strategic plan, which I want you to respond on that specific point, to do that. you know, and MCPS, work with MCPS, work with us. We have to collectively share that burden, but I just think it's something we have to do. So I just want to put a point in for staff that we need to follow up on. It's not enough to go 1, 2, 3, 4 at a time. We have to have a plan to get to all these schools and be realistic with the public about how we're going to get there. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, but you're welcome to or not. Okay, well, let's just do it then. That's fine.
I think that's folks to agree with your intent that we need to make something happen. Chair Albanos.
Well, thank you. I just very much associate myself with everybody's comments to date. Linkages and our wellness centers are such a, as we all know, such a critical component to the families that they serve, and such an important element, especially now within the infrastructure of families. And it just continues this concept of a neighborhood school, which we know is a best practice. And I want to welcome you, Mr. Adams. We've had the opportunity to work together before, but it's the first time I've had the opportunity to formally talk to you in this new capacity that you have. And I see my colleague and friend David Dice in the audience from the Department of General Services, who certainly knows how to make a dollar out of 75 cents, and appreciate all of his efforts. That's right. But I just want to reinforce very much what Council Member Navarro just talked about earlier, which is when there are opportunities for capital projects through an economies of scale, we should be looking as creatively as possible to help build out and carve out space, because we know that the needs are going to continue to grow. And it will, as she said so eloquently, be so much more expensive to add on to projects. And so that's why I think it is important for us to focus on those schools that are clearly in the most need and need the most support services, but also chew gum at the same time as projects become available. I know that DGS has very, in an efficient way, is looking at combining different county-based services in the same facilities moving forward. Wheaton Recreation Center and Library is one of the best examples of that recently. So that is very important for us to focus on moving forward. And operating costs are going to be difficult, but we want to have the opportunity and not miss out on it.
So I don't think I heard a date for when the new strategic plan is going to be in place. Do we have that?
So I think that the earliest date we can tell you is that it'll be ready by the spring of this year. So
would that be pre-budget or post-budget?
I think probably post-budget is I'm thinking, but I'm not sure. So April, during.
Post-budget is like
late
summer.
Well, May. So May, so.
Right.
How far along in the process are we? Oh, great, we have.
Good afternoon. For the record, Monica Martin, Administrator for Linkages to Learning with HHS. I'm sorry. I thought our director knew I was here to assist if available. So we do have a retreat of the Advisory Group for Linkages to Learning scheduled the 20th of this month. That's next week, isn't it? And we follow up to that with an open meeting in March. We don't have that date scheduled yet. That's why you don't have an exact date. But the intent is to have the recommendations to you by budget.
Excellent. That is fantastic. That's much better news. There you go. Yes, we do too. No offense, but you know. All right.
Can I walk you through, though, the recommendations?
Yes, please.
So we are on the same page. So would it be appropriate to say that the three first ones, which is just kind of tweaking the expenditure schedule and the PDF to make sure it's just in line with what's going on?
There you go.
Okay. And then what I'm hearing from the Joint Committee is that for projects that schools are moving forward with that have that are potential linkages sites, they're in the near term, that you would like to have funds programmed for space. So that would include Neelsville and Roscoe Nix and Crest Haven Elementary Schools.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the one last thing that I had suggested that the Joint Committee consider is, again, for the two other sites that had, you know, the highest ever farms rates, which were Watkins Mill Elementary School and Montgomery Village Middle School. would you want to get information about how much space would cost or whether there is existing space at those sites?
Yeah, it would be helpful to have that information. Obviously, with the constraints with our CIP, we know that we may not get there, but it'd be helpful to have, as Glenn, now that the CIP's been transmitted over to us, and Keith worked their magic when it comes to dealing with where things may fall. Certainly, if we have an opportunity, it'd be great to have the information around those so that we can take advantage of that as well.
Sure, and the Joint Committee can consider it during budget discussions as you hear the strategic plan to decide whether to, how to move forward with those projects.
Exactly, and then we'll have the guidance of the Linkage to Learning new strategic plan as well, which will help us to guide us as well.
It's a very bold and forward-looking strategic plan that includes as many sites as possible.
Monica, that was to you,
Monica, I'm
from
looking at
Councilmember
you.
Jawando. He wants your plan to be bold and innovative.
I'm sorry. Director Crown.
All right, Vivian. Sorry, Lindsay, go ahead.
So for concerning Cresthaven and Roscoe Nix, the only reason we did not look at adding construction dollars is because MCPS told us that there's delays there, and so we didn't know when the exact construction was going to take place, so we didn't want to program those dollars at this time.
Seth?
So just to correct, not quite a delay, but we were asked to take a step back on those two projects. Roscoe Nix and Cresthaven are intended to relieve a realization at Joan Lelick Elementary School. Looking at those two sites and the amount of work involved, we really are struggling with the amount of disruptions that would cause. So we're taking a half a step back, looking at other geographic areas around Joanne Lelick to serve that community. And we will be coming back with the board's recommendation in a couple weeks. We'll have more discussions next week, and we'll be back a little bit later on that.
So we can address that all encompassing, but thank you, Lindsay, for letting us know the thinking that was associated with why that wasn't programmed in. That's incredibly helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
So now we can go back to the child care renovations project, now that we have.
1 second, Councilmember Navarro. Yeah.
Yeah, so Vivian, so then also on page 5 in the top, you do have the table that shows the dates for the MCPS projected as recommended by the Board of Education, schedule updates, and Lee Middle School has been delayed because now it's a full replacement, so, it's important to say that. But where does that leave this conversation about linkages to learning? So she said that it's not in the PDF at all, but
I
it is.
The funding is programmed, but it doesn't show, it's not in the language of the PDF, so we just want to make sure that it's.
Can we update?
And then we update the extent.
Okay, so we are going to update the language. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Just want to make sure.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Vivian.
Total 6-year amount would be $26,744,000. The recommended funding source is GO bonds. The requested fiscal year 21 appropriation is $2.427 million, and the estimated fiscal year 22 appropriation is $2.793 million. Again, this is a level of effort project that provides for the renovation of child care facilities and county buildings to ensure compliance with the ADA and safety concerns, and there's, provides ADA compliant playgrounds and replacement of modular facilities, and ADA remediation. So the fiscal year 21 to fiscal year 22 candidate projects are listed on page 2 of your packet, and it's listed by the type of work that is anticipated to be done. Currently, the executive is in the process of evaluating these facilities and developing a program of requirements for the different types of work that is anticipated. The prioritization for construction will depend on the condition of facilities as the main consideration, but also consider ease of implementation, constraints, site constraints, and coordination with other funding proposed in for each year is anticipated to cover 1 to 2 projects. But right now, because the PORs are not completed and there's not specific information about the scope of work and required remediation for each site, as well as the schedule for design and construction and associated costs for each facility, Council staff recommends approving the expenditure schedule and appropriations recommended by the executive, subject to availability of funds and reconciliation. And in addition, in order to exercise oversight over the expenditure of construction funding, the Joint Committee should approve language of the PDF that requires notice and information be provided to the Council in writing 60 days before construction funding is obligated or spent, providing important information related to scope and cost estimates.
So, Mr. Dyson, welcome. I want to ask you, how large is the scale of what remediation is necessary throughout the county beyond what's already included as a part of this child care renovation PDF?
Thank you. David Dice, Director, Montgomery County Department of General Services. My apologies for being a little bit late. The work does vary from site to site. Some of these, I'm sure you've been in many of these facilities. Some of them are older, some of them are newer. Almost all of them, well, in fact, all of them need some form of either remediation and improvement or outright replacement. We're targeting 8 for replacement and others for remediation. And so they do vary. The ADA requirements vary from ramps and paths of travel, both to the facilities themselves as well as the associated playgrounds, and others are much more extensive. If I can just go on and elaborate on what the approach is, we're working with our colleagues, real clients at HHS. This level of effort project, like many of them, is the result of lessons learned. These facilities have been in operation for some time. We've learned a lot, and that includes both what kind of structures to put in, as well as I've heard the discussion just prior to this, addressing the need where it can be met. So we are developing with our colleagues a standard POR of 3 types of sizes, typical facilities that both presently and perhaps in the future will be able to be much more fluid in responding to needs, so that we have a standard, we can go in and do it. We're looking at, in fact, I'm attending a conference in Orlando in March with the Modular Manufacturers Association to make contacts and scope out where that industry is now. In the past, modulars were glorified construction trailers that really no one would really want to be in. The industry's changed considerably, matured a lot with a lot of technological advancements, and our hope is that we can have both a standard model of different sizes addressing the different needs that incorporate and already comply with all codes, including ADA, fire codes, and the like, nationally as well as internationally. The real variable with these sites is the site conditions. Because we can't just shut down a center, in many cases we're going to be pouring a new foundation, a slab adjacent to it. In other cases, the site creates even more challenges. Some of these will involve large cranes to crane a new demolition's fun and easy. Bringing in a new unit will have more challenges. So we're going to have to look at each one of these sites as far as the site development. That process is underway, but first we need to have the standard program of requirements. As I said, we're working with HHS, and that should be done in May, where we'll have a standardized approach and then can put out a contract for prototypical units, and where we're going to start first in order to make progress, because we don't want to postpone addressing the various needs. The facilities themselves, they have a process. They have to go through program requirements, bids and awards, and manufacture. But we can make progress on playgrounds and other remediation. I met with my staff a few weeks ago and they laid out the schedule, and I said, I want to do something now. And so we're gonna move forward this calendar year at Colesville. DGS has been doing an awful lot of other improvements at the Colesville facility. We're going to start with the ADA remediation at Colesville, and in this calendar year, probably early fiscal year 21, other ADA remediations, Kid Stop 21-22, Potomac in 22, and Lone Oak 22-23. They basically run about, because we can do design while we're doing construction of one, so they overlap by about 4 months in that process. Again, since every site's different, how we address those are different. Playgrounds are pretty straightforward. Again, the PORs should be done, I said May, actually it's March, excuse me, should be done in March so that we'll be able to move forward with playground remediation pretty soon, pretty quick. There's some outstanding issues regarding playground surfaces and all that we're still trying to work out. And again, the replacements themselves, Waring in FY23, Woodland in 24, Resnick in 25, and MLK in 26. So that's the current schedule. As things develop, if we have a good partner as a modular manufacturer and subject to the availability of funding and capacity, we can adjust that. We hope to be able to be more aggressive, but we'll update the council, Ms. Yao's recommendation. Once we have all of these other answers in place, we will develop an overall project schedule so that we can present that to council and look over the next 5 to 6 years, and you'll know what, when, and where. And we will periodically update that, and certainly can update council when funds are needing to be obligated. That's where I prefer to go. I really can't wait to get council approval to spend money, because once it's obligated, I need to spend it. But and trust me, once it's obligated, I will spend it. But we'll certainly keep you updated on our schedule so that you'll know what that expenditure rate looks like.
And of course, as Council Chair Alberno said, you're spending 75 cents out of every dollar. So we really appreciate that. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to connect that particular item in the packet to the child care in schools item, especially, specifically page 7 and some of the notes, bullet points here that Vivian put forth for us. So, I mean, thinking really bold, the whole point of the early child, care and education initiative was for us to be very specific about what could be an action plan and what are the low-hanging fruits and what are some of the things that we were going to do while we were taking care of the low-hanging fruit. And so one of the things we were supposed to do was this sort of audit of possible commercial, vacant commercial space that perhaps we could take advantage of, especially in targeted areas for child care options, as well as public facilities and even faith-based communities. And so I guess I'm a little bit disappointed that here we are, at a moment where we can look at our CIP. This is the 6th year, which is the time for us to think through some investments to take advantage of these possible facilities that it doesn't seem that there's anything here for that. And I feel like that's going to, get us behind the 8 ball in what we said we were going to do with this 4-year action plan. So I'm trying to understand, because if I'm reading correctly, the executive did not recommend any spending under the umbrella project for the child care in schools, but there's also doesn't seem to be anything regarding the audit of possible commercial areas. I will share that, for example, we made specific request for the Park and Planning building on Lot 13 in Wheaton to incorporate a child care space. And at this point, they were having a real challenge finding a vendor. And so my conversation with the executive was, well, here's a prime opportunity for us to invest in that build out, to take care of those items that are the most costly, and be able to then attract a provider that would be able to perhaps have, I don't know, 50% of the slots for low-income children or children receiving subsidies, for example. So it's a private-public partnership, but we're putting in some money because we made a commitment. So I'm really concerned that here we are with this conversation about the CIP, and there doesn't seem to be any funds that we could then access in order to take advantage of any commercial spot or county facility spot, or maybe a faith-based community that we can come in, build out a space, be able to provide then slots for low-income children because we're subsidizing those costs. So where are we with that audit? Is there anybody that has any updates on the audit?
I can't speak to the audit. We can come back to that in just a minute. But one thing I would say, a lot of the options that you're discussing are not so much CIP items as they would be operating budget. So if we were going to be leasing a space, for instance.
So if we were going to be if we were to take up a space and build it out.
Building out, if it's a space we don't own, we can't use bonds. So oftentimes those are sort of worked into the rent, and it's handled through the leasing NDA. And there might be an instance where we could somehow use the CIP, but generally it's more of an operating budget.
So are you saying then that the operating budget, there would be, because I know Vivian pointed out that there was no money in the CIP for any of this. So are you saying that that's because in the operating budget we should expect to see then a particular item regarding that?
I am not familiar with what's going on the operating budget side, but I know we did discuss that when we were talking about the CIP. And
so you discussed that we don't have anything in the CIP because that would most likely be done through lease or any other type of more.
Correct. That was what was being. We knew we were interested in the commercial space and those kinds of things, and that would generally be more of an operating budget issue.
Anybody else? Any updates on that?
So just an observation. Back when we were doing the hearing on ECEI, the update on the ECEI, I think we talked about the need to do you're calling an audit, I think, a supply and demand study for child and adolescent for child care in county, and part of that looking at commercial and public space opportunities, I think. So I think that's. When you're talking audit, I think that's what you're referring to, sort of understanding where there's space.
Well, in the action plan, since I wrote it, the idea was for us, because one of the biggest challenges, of course, is the fact that we don't have physical facilities, right? And so the idea was, okay, while we expand family childcare, which is kind of the low-hanging fruit, let's also do some kind of a survey audit or whatever of vacant commercial areas, because we know we have some commercial areas where we have some vacancies, especially in targeted geographic areas, and then see if we can lease those, build them out, to be able to provide. Same with some county facilities. We already have a law that requires us to do a feasibility for every single county facility. So then, take to see where we are with that, and also the faith-based, and see if there are any communities. And so the idea was, if we identify those, then we can see whether we're going to need money to prime those up and be able to provide it through there. But, if that takes place more in the operating budget side, then cool. I just want to make sure that we have that ready for us to react to.
So I'm Barbara Andrews, the Administrator for Early Childhood Services in HHS. The Facilities Committee of the initiative is tasked with working on that. So we're getting in touch with Parks and Planning to discuss where vacant commercial space is, to do that kind of a survey. But the couple of things, you can't go into just any commercial space and build childcare. So we're also working with permitting on that, DPO on that. And understanding what are the best places to go into, what are not. Another point that was raised was, if you go into an office park where there's nothing around and it's vacant, people aren't going to come there to bring their children. They're going to come there to bring their children if they're working in that space. If it's not a neighborhood, close to a neighborhood.
I would just say that we already have studies that we have done that have looked at where we have childcare deserts. Especially when it comes to centers specifically. Right. And so if there are no centers, so if there are commercial spaces in those geographic areas,
we'll absolutely be looking at them, but we do need the supply and demand study to really understand where people need care. Just because it's a desert doesn't mean that's where you need the child care. It looks that way, but you may also have large amounts of family child care. And so
I will defer to the experts, but I can tell you, someone who worked in this field, I can tell you right now, for example, Long Branch all those apartment buildings
Oh, absolutely.
are maxed out with childcare, unregulated childcare. Okay, so it may not seem like you need it, but the fact is that when you look at what childcare spaces are, centers are around, you won't find them, which could mean that we need to subsidize a lot of that. So it is difficult when you do the supply and demand, et cetera. If you're just looking for profitable childcare centers, we're not going to be able to find that. It's not going to work. We're going to have to subsidize. So that's why I'm talking about, let's make sure that through our CIP and our operating budget, there will be some areas like that in Germantown, et cetera, where we may need to subsidize the build out, et cetera, because a commercial concept is not going to work.
Absolutely, and that's the conversation we're having with the Parks and Planning building right now too. It's your conversation with the county executive, and we're working with them now on what that RFP needs to look like, and helping them figure out green space, because that was one of their big issues, was they didn't have enough green space to build a large enough center to make it
Are you talking
viable.
about Lot 13 specifically? Is that what you're talking about? Are you?
I don't know
Which one are you referring to? I'm sorry.
Parking. Yeah.
Park and Planning Building, Lot 13.
Yeah.
I know the playground is an issue, but again, I mean, I'm not going to belabor the point. All I'm going to say is, I think it may behoove whoever's working on this to also work with some of the nonprofit organizations that are on the ground, because just looking at sort of the usual data doesn't give you a real clear picture of where those children are.
Right.
And looking at market rate type of profit, profitability, it's also not give us a real picture of where the need is. So we do need to do a little bit deeper, digging, and we will need to put forth some additional funding to make those centers work for those communities, so they will come out of that unregulated care and actually take their children there. If not, it's not going to work. So it's going to look as if there isn't a demand, but there is.
I understand.
Yeah. Thank you.
So the plan is to put together an RFP as quickly as possible for the supply and demand study, and to connect that to deserts, and to connect that to where we know we have unregulated care, and where we know we have a lot of low-income families and the density of low-income families. And there is a marketing analysis as part of that, just to be sure that it is viable for a child care program. We have a few programs that have really struggled in public space, because we put them in a school where there's a lot of public pre-K and a lot of Head Start, and then you go down the hall and you have to pay for the child care. So that's been an issue for that's just what we're hearing from directors when we bring them in to have a conversation with us. But the plan is to put an RFP together and have this supply and demand study done at the beginning of the fiscal year into the fall.
Okay. So if maybe when the RFP is done, I would really like to take a look at that and see how it's being constructed, because there is a disconnect between saying that somehow there isn't a need, or that we've heard feedback there isn't a need, when we know that there is this very large proportion of children right now entering kindergarten already presenting with an opportunity gap, academic achievement gap, because they're not in high quality early care and education in these particular zip codes. And so I'm not convinced, and I'm not going to believe a study that tells me that somehow there isn't a demand for quality care there, right? So how we construct these RFPs are going to be really important, and who is going in there to figure this data out is going to be really critical, because if not, we're setting ourselves up, I think, for failure, and that would not be good. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just say that demand is relative. If you don't know what you don't know, then you don't know that you're missing something. And so a lot of people who have their children in unlicensed, unregulated care right now don't realize what kinds of disadvantages that's putting their children into. And so part of the work around current commission and the bill that just came out on Friday is about making sure that folks understand that. So I think that the dynamic that we currently had in terms of early care and education is going to completely change. So the mindset that folks have had with regards to how important this is about to change in the state of Maryland as a whole. And so from that perspective, it really is timely for us to be analyzing this and really starting to understand that folks who may have been comfortable with, and so certainly there are places where I'm sure that folks are happy sending their child to a place where they know it's incredibly affordable and they don't know about what educational outcomes may be there for their child. But they're soon going to know, because there's a lot of publication that's going to go around. There's a very robust part of the outreach that goes with Kerwin and the recommendations for pre-K. I know, because just as Councilmember wrote her piece, I wrote that one. And so from that perspective, it's going to be one in which I think is really going to change the dynamic. So your point is understood. I just think that the time is changing to where that may no longer be the case. Vivian, you wanted to weigh in. You were going to say something.
I think I wanted to make sure that you heard from HHS. About
Okay.
What's going on with ECEI.
Great.
So just one thing to respond to both of you on that point. I think that from my perspective, this supply and demand study does exactly what you're describing. It's all the data sources that we have, what we know prior, and takes a look at where the demand is, where the demand doesn't appear to be, where people are going, how far they have to go to get to child care, how much they can spend on it. That for me is at baseline, understanding what this market looks like and whether or not someone can make a business go of it as a business, but also or whether we have to subsidize it. But I also think the other piece that we talked about during the hearing last week was about the marketing issues around this and needing to let people know what's available and what the alternatives are, and that there are some subsidies available for them to give them a chance to get their child into a higher level of child care. So that for me is a piece of the combination of the survey and the marketing will do for us.
Now, I did want to get back to what Councilmember Navarro was initially talking about with you, Mr. Dice, and then Ms. Beck, you weighed in on this in terms of, I thought that there have been instances where we've actually used capital funds on property that we didn't own.
It does depend on the nature and duration of the lease, where we have gotten into this.
I know we've done it before.
Yes, if it's and we spoke with bond counsel about this, but we're talking extremely long-term leases where the difference between ownership and having a 90-year condominium interest is virtually indistinguishable.
Understood.
Or we have to use cash.
Okay. All right. So I guess, look, from the perspective and the line of questioning where Councilmember Navarro is, obviously we know that we continue to struggle with vacant office space. We've all had a conversation around whether or not we could utilize that vacant office space for other kinds of uses. I know the current county executive, when he was here, had those same sort of discussions. So I know he's been very intentional about saying we need to do more about that. I sat right next to him as he said it. And so I hope that when it comes to this operating budget, as Ms. Beck espoused, that we will be looking at opportunities that are out there, because there is no question. I mean, all of us as either district council members or at large can identify and rattle off a number of vacant office buildings where I know that childcare could work, and certainly with some sort of subsidy would still be able to support our communities in areas that greatly need it. And so from that perspective, I think that there's a lot more that we can talk about, but certainly one in which we'll discuss in the process of our operating budget deliberations. So
one thing I should mention,
Respect.
in MCPS's CIP, there's the Early Care Center at Watkins Mill.
Absolutely. Yep. Okay.
And actually, the only thing I wanted to mention with this is, again, I'm hoping that HHS and the executive can explore doing this demand study as quickly as possible, and assessing available space as quickly as possible. Again, the more time it takes, the more there's kids that could use those supports, and we're not moving forward. So I do want to just,
Is there a way to almost triage the study? So, because we do have data on some of the particular hot spots where we know we have a really, really high need. Would there be a way to maybe start with those, in terms of doing like an interim report out? So whether it's the Long Branch area or the Wheaton area, and then see whether there's a way to focus on those in Up County, maybe Germantown or Montgomery Village, so that at least we can start addressing some of the highest need areas first.
I assume you mean in the process of working with someone to do the supply and demand study, can they triage those first, or areas? that
Right,
you
so
know
to
we-
address what
Yeah,
Vivian was saying.
I
in
don't
terms,
see any reason why not.
of timeline, so that way we don't wait for the full,
Yeah, absolutely.
thing. That'd be great, thanks.
My presumption is that we prioritize what we know based on what we know and then build out from there. So to the extent we have those studies and they tell us where we need to be, then why wouldn't we use those to begin with?
Yeah, we have.
And I just wanted to make sure, going back to the childcare renovations, again, I didn't hear dissent or pushback against the council staff's recommendation, but I just want to make sure that they were okay with the joint committee.
Yeah, no, I don't see any objection, so yeah.
Great.
All right. And
That's
it. Yep, because we already talked about High School Wellness Center, right?
Did.
Excellent. All right, so again, we will reconvene to talk about some of these items with operating budget, and the council's been very clear in terms of its support for us moving forward as aggressively as possible in a number of these different initiatives. So certainly, we understand that the county executive is trying to achieve a balanced budget and has a number of different priorities, but I know that he sat here. I know that he espoused many of the same concerns that we do, and so it's our hope that when we see this operating budget that comes over March 15th, that it's certainly reflective of the great work that he's done here as a part of this council and reflects the great need that we're seeing in our community. So with that, we'll close out and we'll adjourn. Thank you very much.
Flopper Road, Merrill 117 to Middlebrook Road.
Northbound from Father Herzig Boulevard to the truck scales.
Slow on Interstate 495 in the following locations.
Loop of the I-495 from Old Georgetown Road, Maryland 187 to Georgia Avenue, Maryland 97.
Information. Please call the Transit Information Center at 240-777-7433.
We will continue to monitor transportation conditions throughout the day. When those conditions change, this station is updated with up-to-date transportation information to aid you in your daily commute.
Wet and maybe slippery. Please allow more space between